I'll just start over. I'm sorry.
Okay, so here we are, session 9. And we have 2 panelists for this session on grief and loss. Chanel Yaramillo. I got it right, didn't I, Chanel? Okay.
Yeah.
And Chanel is a bioenergetic counselor and coach and an adjunct professor. And she's also a yoga teacher. And she works and lives in Omaha. And she just completed a wonderful doctoral dissertation on the effect of yoga on autoimmune diseases. And I'm sure if any of you out there are interested in it, that she'd be happy to send you a copy, right, Chanel?
I would.
Yeah.
For a little light reading.
Yeah. Well, I actually enjoyed reading it.
Oh, thank you.
I really enjoyed both the way you went about it and the stories of the women that you interviewed and what they had to say about how it transformed their illness and basically their whole lives, from what I could tell. Yeah. Okay, and then Jean's with us. Jean Denny is with us. She's been with us before, and she's a longtime pal and former bridge builder, civil engineer, and now body psychotherapist, and all-around smart lady.
Thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
And I've done a little hospice work in my day, too, so I might throw that in there.
Yeah, which is perfect for this topic. Okay, but so to get started on it, why don't we head right into review session 8, the last session. It's been 3 weeks since the last session. It's easy to forget a lot of stuff during that time. So last session was on how does sex impact the brain. We're just going to cruise through these slides and not spend a lot of time with them, but mostly, again, I reiterate that the reason I do this is because repetition is really good and helps with learning. The other thing that's good for learning, I don't know if any of you tried it, but that's the research on how prediction ahead of time actually helps reinforce learning. So I asked you to predict what I would be covering in this upcoming class, and for those of you who took the time to actually make a prediction, if we could do a test to measure, how much you'd remember versus how much you wouldn't, we'd find that, your prediction, even if it's not right at all, would still enhance the learning that you would take away and things you remember from the session. Okay, last session, number 8, how does sex impact the brain? So we reviewed section 7, and I had you watch the 4 interview segments with Deborah LaFave, just as an example of how ungrieved loss and trauma can fragment our neural integration in ways that mostly what happens, I think, is it doesn't allow us to actually consider consequences and think in big picture scenarios. We're more prone to things like immediate gratification, short-term thinking, reduced impulse control as a consequence of traumatic experience that never get addressed, integrated, and resolved. So then we went to the dozen questions that we asked, and I'm just going to scroll through those in slide 3. And then we'll take each of them in turn. So on slide 4, we looked at exactly what we mean by sex. And basically, I put a definition up there that I was working with in that session. So basically, it's sexual intercourse or gender categories. All right. They put a little picture in there on slide 4 of a guy reading a book, How to Make Love, which I thought was pretty good. Especially at his apparent age, right?
It's
All
his
right.
expression.
Yeah.
It's shocked.
Nobody ever told me that.
It must be from the 1960s or something.
Right. Okay. And then we looked at slide 5. We looked at the benefits of healthy sex, the health benefits of healthy sex, and there are quite a number of them. Right. And not just one kind of sex, but any sexual engagement offers a number of significant benefits. Yeah. And then I asked you to take a sex test. And I asked the question, which person will enjoy sexual experiences more, person A or person B? And essentially, what I'm arguing is that people who have brains and bodies that process more energy and information enjoy sexual experiences more. It's difficult to make a comparison because, how do you measure, A, how do you measure what capacity you have for processing energy and information, and B, what do you compare it to, right? Well, I think you could actually do a test to find that out. You could probably interview people at different ages with the assumption that the older and more experienced you are, the greater your capacity to process energy information to a point, and then do a comparison with self-reported satisfaction. That's just an idea that's coming to me as I'm reviewing this slide. Yeah. So then I also put a slide up there with a woman showing a head full of defenses, psychological defenses. And a head full of psychological defenses is not really great to engage with sex in. And why that might be, we'll explore actually in the next session. Yeah, so then we looked at some fun stuff that I just was curious about and wanted to put in here, and that is the record for most offspring. I'm still amazed by these numbers. It seems just incomprehensible to me. Living in a family with 69 children. And Jean, you thought 4 was a lot. And Chanel, you think 3 is a lot.
It is a lot.
69. Imagine. And then we looked at slide 8. We looked at the Darger family raising 24 children. But they have a lot of help, or he has a lot of help. 3 wives. They all look so happy and joyful here, don't they? Pretty much.
That's because there's 3 moms.
Pardon? Say that again?
So that's because there's 3 moms. My mom's one of 17.
One of 17 children?
And that's just 1 mom and 1 dad.
Wow. So, yeah, that's a big family.
Yeah, and her mom suffered greatly from depression. I think just all those babies.
Well, when I think about depression, I think of depression as a reduced flow of energy and information. Right? And so I can easily imagine trying to manage the energies, just the energies of 17 kids. Being in a family with 17 kids, I think
I can't imagine that, actually.
It'd just be totally overwhelming.
Yeah.
The stress levels, I imagine, would be pretty high. Yeah. So then we looked at a couple of statistics. One is that, and this is from Blum's book, which I show at the end here, 83% of the world's cultures are polygamous. So I just want to revisit this point. It's not 83% of the people in a culture are polygamous. So like 83% of the people in America aren't polygamous. But 83% of the different cultures in the world are polygamous. And most of them are Aboriginal cultures, right? And then 97% of all mammals are promiscuous. So the basic theory here, or the basic takeaway here, is that life really wants to perpetuate itself. And will do whatever needs to be done to have that happen. Even though sometimes it might not look that way. Like 27 kids. That might be
fascinating.
Go ahead.
No, yeah, I'm just fascinated by this 83% figure.
Yeah.
Where that came from.
It came from Deborah Blum's book, Sex in the Brain.
That's a really good book.
Page 83, I think. Yeah. Okay, and then on slide 9, we looked at bad habits, sexting while having sex, which is, if we think of not just, sexual relations as a part of what's valuable and useful and good for the brain in human relations. And we looked at what grows secure attachment in the earlier session, and we discussed and discovered that contingent communication, paying attention, accurately receiving messages, and then responding in a timely and effective manner. I mean, those three things also apply to sexual relations, right? And so if somebody's on the phone in bed, that's not working. That's really, that's not a good prognosis for that relationship.
Yeah.
And I bet it probably goes on, well, and they say here, no, they don't say, 12% say their smartphone gets in the way of their sexual relationships. 1 in 8. That's a lot. That is a lot. All right. What does sex hormones do? Slide 10. Okay, so we explored how testosterone in men and estrogen in women affect body, brain, and being, and they do, profoundly. And they especially affect us during rapid growth cycles. So puberty, and then around age 25, the brain neurogenesis, the growth of new cells, maxes out. And then as we age and go through transitions, male and female menopause, right? These hormones are really powerful, and they have powerful effects. And so from my perspective, it's like my great revelation was that it's not me that's messed up, it's my brain. Well, that's equally true of our hormonal life, right? These are things that, as we grow, we actually have to find skillful ways to try to deal with and integrate into our lives. And we don't get a lot of instruction on the best ways to do that. I remember, this is really interesting, I remember as a young boy, I was going into puberty, and one day I looked down at my genital area, and there was this brown line running from my belly button to the top of my penis. And it freaked me out because it was never there before, and I didn't know what it was. I think it was probably at the beginning of a hairline where the hair would begin to grow out. But there was no instruction about what that might be and how if it was serious, and there was nobody to take it to talk about, right? And so I could, even now, just thinking about it, I can feel the level of stress hormones rise in the response to that, that unfolding. So as I think now about these effects, it's really important to have places to go with these kinds of changes that follow us through the whole human developmental cycle. And it's part of one of the great things the internet is good for. Like the situation I just described, I could go on the internet and look it up and have my anxiety allayed. So there's hope for young teenage boys. Okay. You hear that, Chanel?
And my kids they show me everything, which sometimes I'm like, please don't. We'll look at it in the book.
Okay. Very good.
I didn't have that problem, but, maybe that was a problem.
The boys didn't come to you?
No, not really.
They go to Nick?
I don't know. I didn't ask him.
Huh.
I don't think they did. I think they had each other. I think that's the way it works.
For Dad, he sends them back to Mom.
No.
Okay, slide 11, we looked at low T guys and gals and how important they actually are in the culture, taking over these roles, providing us with social glue. So it's really good to have house husbands and house moms if it's a same-sex relationship, because they do end up modeling for children that, to help, for one thing, do away with stereotypes, right? Dads can actually function in a kitchen. They can actually do housework. It's not, some kind of, it's mostly just a cultural, division of labor that's evolved over time, but it doesn't have to be that, right? All right. And we looked at slide 12, the love hormone, oxytocin, 5 things that it does for us, social intelligence, relaxation response, can cure headaches, improve sleep, and help us fondly remember Mom, because that's where we got our first exposure to oxytocin. Hopefully, ideally.
Hopefully.
Yeah, not everybody does, obviously. So slide 13, we looked at what makes sex good or bad, and I was sort of tongue-in-cheek thinking about it in terms of dichotomies like that. And then looking at, again, taking it back to the thinking of the brain as a network that processes energy and information. And I realized that I'm going to be coming back to this concept about this part of the brain and thinking about it this way, because I find it so enormously useful. Just earlier we were talking about depression, and I mentioned that, I think of depression as, your network isn't functioning well, right? You're just not processing energy in the way that you normally would. And so when that happens, we have a general all-purpose term called depression, right? And oftentimes people aren't suffering clinical depression when that's what it's showing up as. Like, I remember when I was transitioning from being a house builder to whatever was next, I didn't know what was next, and so I was sitting a lot with inaction. And if you looked at me from the outside, it looked like I was depressed because I wasn't doing anything, right? But I wasn't depressed because I know what depression feels like, and it's a qualitatively different experience. Yeah, this was just an uncertainty and nowhere to take my energy and focus it and channel and direct it. So thinking about it this way and transferring our thoughts about it this way, at least for me, presents lots of opportunities for creative experimentation and inquiry, right? If my network's not processing energy information well right now, what might be causing that? And how might I be able to increase our processing capacity? All right, slide 14, we took time for questions. Slide 15, we looked at what is the sex-addicted brain, and we took a piece out of a blog that I find very helpful. Also, there's a wonderful article. I think I'll make a note to send it to folks. It's written by, it's on the Mind Life Institute website. It's a blog post there by a neuroscientist named Mark Lewis. And he used to be a crack addict, cocaine addict, and he recovered from it. And he's written about what his experience is like from the perspective of a brain scientist. And it's really interesting, and it's he quotes some amazing research, and I just want to mention a piece of it here. So they looked at recovered crack addicts, and they looked at their brains, or cocaine addicts it was. And what they discovered is that when people recover from cocaine addiction, they have this huge blooming in their brain's capacity to process energy and information in particular parts of the brain that are related to impulse control and social engagement, mainly the prefrontal cortex, right? And when they compare the growth in people who've recovered from addiction, their development surpasses regular development in normal people. So it's like addiction has served as a kind of like a growth suppressant, the way it might happen when you trim back plants to make them grow faster. And then when you actually are free of the substance that you're addicted to, growth just goes crazy.
That's really interesting, Mark. That's a lot like the resilience research that Robert Scare talks about, yeah?
Yeah. It's a totally surprising finding, right?
Yeah. In a way, yeah.
Yeah. I sent it to a friend of mine. He said, I couldn't read the whole article because I'm going out to get high and start my involvement.
Start my addiction regime.
So I can reap the benefits of rehab. Yeah. All right, so slide 16 was the rest of the excerpt from the Sex Addicted Brain blog, and just exploring the addiction cycle, right? And here's the thing that I want to reiterate about all these kinds of things, right? People are always doing the best they can with the neural network and the brain body that they have to work with in the moment. And then ideally, in the next moment, we do a little better. One of the things I said at the talk on Saturday that people really appreciated was this quote from Zen teacher Shinryu Suzuki, and started the San Francisco Zen Center. And he said, we're all absolutely perfect just as we are. And we can all use a little improvement. So basically he's speaking to neurophysiology, right? You know, the brain and body are what they are in any moment. And as we begin to learn and grow and change, you know, things inside us change, connections get made, other connections die away, and we hopefully become more skillful in the way we operate in the world. Slide 17, we looked at the footwork of recovery and how important community is in recovery. You know, it's really, really difficult to try to deal with addictions on our own. whether it's sexual addictions or drug addictions or food addictions or whatever it is. Social neuroscience advocates for really needing other people to help us with this stuff.
Not only addictions, I think almost anything, but including what we're going to talk about tonight, especially.
Yeah.
That's more and more clear to me how much we need communities in all of the healing and growth work we do.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, slide 18, what makes people abuse others sexually, brain and schizophrenia. Basically, it's a disorganized brains that don't work well, brains that have been damaged themselves. I mean, there's a high correlation between, if you look at people who abuse others sexually and you look at their developmental history, what you'll discover is that they were victims themselves. They were abused, like Deborah LaFave. Yeah, and so you see that, you know, if there's probably one takeaway from these whole 12 sessions, it would be that the brain is constantly changing. It's constantly changing. Cells are constantly being born, constantly dying, constantly making connections, and constantly breaking connections. Does sex really happen mostly in the brain? And I wrote here that all embodied experiences need to operate through the brain. It's essentially a design reality limitation. But there are, if you look at slide 20, natural states that are better than sexual orgasm, which is hard to believe unless you've experienced them, right? And I gave Robert Heath's team's account of things that actually helped to make that a reality. I remember this wonderful Zen story where somebody came to a teacher whose order was one that practiced celibacy, and, you know, the prospective student said, well, why do you practice celibacy? And the teacher said, well, why do you, practice sexual engagement? And the guy said, well, because it feels so good. And the Zen teacher said, precisely. So basically he's saying, that there are states that we can grow into as we increase our capacity to process ever increasing amounts of energy and information that actually go beyond what we customarily experience as loving sexual orgasm. Okay, slide 21. Can our whole body, brain, being become ecstatically energized? And we spoke about this process of brahmacharya, or tantric celibacy. And so there have been people experimenting with these kinds of ecstatic states for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So we have guides and pathways that people have traveled down that we're free to begin experimenting with ourselves if we feel the pull to do that. Slide 22, the 5 grades of ecstatic happiness. So there's minor happiness, momentary happiness, showering happiness, uplifting happiness, and pervading happiness. So this is a map, basically. You could call it, well, they do call it the ecstatic happiness map. The challenge, though, is if you haven't actually experienced these states and you continue to do the work that you think ideally might be intended to get you there, and it doesn't get you there, then it's hard to believe that these kinds of states can actually happen. And so this is where the element of trust comes in, and faith, right? Which is, in and of itself, can be a challenge, right? How do we know this isn't just a Ponzi scheme or some kind of spiritual con, right? That's the way I think about many of these things, right? I'm a huge skeptic of almost everything alternative. You know that about me, right, Gene?
I do know that about you. I'm just trying not to say anything.
Well, it's almost like I'm from one of your neighboring states, Missouri, right?
Right, yes, you are. Yep,
But here's the thing, right? Unless you have, so there's this developmental process that goes on, which is indicated here. And so if you're at a place in the journey that's really far removed from, say, the pervading happiness states, you really need to honor where you are in a developmental cycle, right? You can't spiritually bypass. You can't just leap and pretend that you're experiencing pervading happiness when you can barely hold on to momentary happiness.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. But if you know that there is a possibility and you're on a journey, I don't know, in some sense it sort of offers some kind of solace. I am where I am. You are where you are.
That's a little different than cynicism, though.
Yeah, I don't actually feel very cynical.
No. Okay.
Except
Skeptical.
Skeptical, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, then slide 23, we looked at this I thought it was a really clever experiment. So that's David Eagleman with his back to us. And he's developed a way to turn your chest into a sensory organ, basically your ear. And so what he's demonstrating, what I took away from this experiment, is that sensory substitution allows us to make any part of our body. I mean, he's doing it with physical tools, electronic tools. But remember, we looked at in the earlier session, we looked at how the whole soft tissue of the body is essentially a semiconductor, right? So theoretically, at least, the description that we saw on the previous slide about pervading happiness, Eagleman here is presenting a possibility for that to me. What do you think?
It's cool.
Oh, go ahead, Jean.
No, go ahead. I had nothing more to say.
Yeah.
I thought this was really cool, because isn't there a disorder where the information gets crisscrossed? So sometimes people will be listening to music and they see imagery rather than hear the music.
Right. It's called synesthesia.
That's right.
Right. And so in synesthesia, what we discover is that neurons, which are generally compartmentalized to certain areas, find their way to snake across customary boundaries and connect up, like sight connects up with hearing, and hearing might connect up with taste. So you get all these cross-sensory information passing back and forth, right?
Yeah.
But what I think is possible is I think we can actually work to cultivate that kind of cross-pollination. And I think probably going forward, more and more people, actually in the last session, we'll look at synesthesia and how it's sort of like, I remember when Ray Moody did the first interviews with people who had experienced near-death experiences, right? We used to think as a culture that wasn't very common. And then Moody did the research, and it turns out that, a huge percentage of the population have had near-death experiences. They just had no cultural mandate to come forward and speak about them, right? But once it's okay and you're not stigmatized for coming out and speaking about these weird experiences, suddenly we discover that they're much more common than we thought. And I think the same is true with synesthesia and all kinds of what do I want to say? I don't want to say abnormal. I want to say unusual energy and information processing capacities. So Eagleman wrote a book called Incognito, which is a wonderful read. He's at the University of Texas, and he's just really innovative in the work he does. And so one of his primary research areas is taking neuroscience into the courtroom. And usually it's for the defense, because his understanding of how brain works is that people who commit crimes, even in the commission of those crimes, are doing the very best they can with the brains they have to work with in the moment. It's a hard sell in this country in 2014, but more and more I think we'll be finding that the laws and people's understanding that, you know, people with disorganized brains, they need help. They don't need punishment. The whole culture suffers when people are punished for their neurological deficiencies.
We'll have to get the brain science on that, and then maybe we can make the case.
Well, there's tons of it. And actually a lot of people are working in neuroethics and in neurojudicial areas. Mostly because lawyers can pay for it, right? Yeah. So then slide 24, we looked at 3 resources. And we invited you to take a look at the RSA video that makes the distinction between empathy and sympathy, and then the Mike Evans video. All right. So that was last time. Now let's go to session 9. Session 9. Here it is, right there. So session 9. Exploring the somatic embodiment of grief and loss. Okay, slide 2. We just did the review. Can you see that GIF that emits all the moving light on the right side of the brain?
Hold on, I'm trying to get it up here.
Yeah.
Slide 2?
Yeah, slide 2.
Yes, it's flashing lights here. Where do you come up with them, Mark?
Well, it's just fun to go out and look around. So basically what I do is I you know, here's a thing that's a little off track, but I really would encourage people to try this. Any topic that you're interested in getting information about, don't go to Google first to get the information. Go to Google Images first. Because it's really interesting what you find when you go to Google Images and look for the information you're looking for. And you'll find, which I do, all kinds of things you never would have expected to find. And it's a lot easier often to find things through Google Images than it is to scroll through, you know, a list of words. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've been experimenting with that a little bit. I know what you mean.
Yeah. It's a whole different way of accessing information. You know, it's also really interesting. When Google first started amassing their image files, they sent me an email asking me if I wanted to participate. And my first thought was, well, this is a stupid thing to do. You know, they want me to put tags on images to describe them. I thought, you know, well, my tags are probably not going to match anybody else's perfectly, right? Because I'm going to see different things in pictures than other people are going to see. They're all, to some extent, like Rorschachs. Well, it turns out that this has been a huge boon to the dissemination of information in the world. Yeah. Okay, slide 3. A griever's dozen questions. And for those of you who took the time, what you'll discover, I think, is that a griever's dozen questions actually turn out to be 11. And I did that on purpose. And one of the reasons I did it is because grief is really, really hard work. It's probably some of the hardest work I've ever done. And it's probably some of the hardest work I've ever seen other people do. For lots of reasons. Right? So, when you're in the middle of grief, you don't have energy to put up 12 and answer 12 whole questions. So we're going to settle on 11 for this session. What exactly is grief and loss? So I'm calling it a composting space-making process that almost always involves loss of love. Someone failing to answer yes to the big brain question. Are you there for me?
That's the Mark Brady definition?
It's basically based on my experience and lots of other people's personal experiences that I know. But then I've taken an excerpt from The Courage to Grieve, which I think is one of the texts I suggest people take a look at. Jean, why don't you read this for us?
Sure. I only see part. Okay, there's the other part.
Yeah.
I hear so many people wanting to know what's normal. Cognitive impairments, sleep disruptions, abrupt mood swings. Sometimes people want to know they're not going crazy. I remember when my youngest brother died. I was just washing out a coffee cup one morning and became aware that part of why I was so tired and foggy was that something in my mind was busily at work revising a new background to all the foreground of my life, a new background in which my brother did not exist. I would want to know roughly how long I could anticipate the intensity of anguish, how long until the pain began to diminish to more handleable levels. I didn't want to know how the thoughts and feelings accompanying such a profound loss are right at the center point of psychospiritual growth. The psyche part being the loss of attachment and the abrupt termination of what I had taken to be an ongoing narrative, and the spiritual part arising from the investigation of what it is to love. I'd want to know how to provide loving, compassionate care for myself. Are you there?
Yeah, so that's a really important piece of grief, for description of grief, in terms of the brain. Because what it's saying is that for however long we have a relationship with someone or something, because we can grieve lots of different things, our brain puts out energy and receives energy back. There's a contingent communication and connection process that's ongoing all the time. And then to either suddenly, or even if you are able to do anticipatory grief, which is to begin the preparation process for somebody leaving or dying, or what's going to happen in the brain is that all the ways and times that you used to put energy out there and get something back, now you no longer will. And so what happens in the brain actually is the network connections, the cells that actually used to be a part of this process, begin to atrophy. They begin to disconnect. And that's a really painful process. And it's one we don't have any control over.
So, Mark, can I politely bring in another point of view, possibly?
Absolutely.
Well, I don't know that that detachment always has to be a painful process. And so that's the subtle area. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I
Can
think
you
there
give
are
an
ways you
example?
can, well, I certainly know of examples of people who have gone through a whole process with their parent dying, for example, and it being slow enough and complete enough as they were going through it, and gentle enough and enough support that it actually just sort of moved through. It's not that there wasn't feeling,
Right.
but there wasn't the kind of grief you're describing right now, which
Right.
almost seems more related to trauma.
Exactly.
So I just want to differentiate between relationship closure or transformation or atrophying of certain kinds of things in relationship and traumatic change, because I think they're different things. And I think in my own experience, the brain can handle transformation of things.
Okay, I totally agree with that. Absolutely. Yeah, so that's a great distinction to make. The difference between both anticipatory and prolonged separation, you know, where you have a chance to actually engage in a process. But very often we don't engage in the process, right? Very often we abruptly sever the process.
Well, exactly. And when we don't engage in the process, it's actually what I think, personally, creates the situation where we have traumatic disengagements and so on. But
brain damage, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to explore this a little bit more as we go forward. So grief changes us in slide 5. The pain sculpts us into someone who understands more deeply, hurts more often, appreciates more quickly, cries more easily, hopes more desperately, and loves more openly. Does that match your experience, Chanel?
I think depending on what the loss is, yes.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I started thinking about is people who, are heavily medicated with for different mental health disorders, who do experience sudden loss, and because the medications are in the way, they're not actually able to grieve properly.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's absolutely my experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When losses are profoundly traumatic, people often do need medications to help them function in the world, right? But at some point they need to be weaned off the medications. And ideally then they can begin to engage in this process of grieving. I mean, I was a grief counselor for 25 plus years, and I have seen people move through and integrate some unbelievably horrendous losses. And so I know it's possible, and I have a pretty good idea of what's required to actually do it. And it's exhausting, and it's something that the culture doesn't really invite us to embrace. More often we're both subtly and overtly told to turn away from it, right? Move on.
To move on.
Get over it. Right? Getting over it and moving through it are two very different processes.
I like what one of my, it's actually one of my clients that's in my group who is a recent widower of about 2 years maybe. And her anger at people saying it's time to move on, right? Very typically. And she realized that what she really needed to do was just move with. Yeah. And that really helped her to talk about moving with, which I think, as we integrate griefs, we don't exactly get rid of them. Somehow we manage to find a way to move with them, I think.
And make more internal space to hold it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as I look over this list of how grief changes us, some of the most compassionate people that I know are the ones who've gone through the most suffering. And they've come out the other side of doing this work with what I perceive to be networks in the brain and body that profoundly process more energy and information than most people.
Well, yeah, because the grief work, as you're describing it, as I'm understanding what we're talking about, has to do with really enlarging our capacity, doesn't it, to take in aspects of our human life or the world, or
our own and other people's, absolutely.
Yeah.
So then I put this little quote in here from C.S. Lewis. No one told me that grief felt so like fear. And again, it depends upon the loss that we're grieving, but I can totally relate to this, right? Okay, slide 6. Can grief work be delayed? So I put a slide in here, a picture of a bunch of airplanes stacked up over an airport landing runway. And I've often felt that this is what people do with grief, right? Because they don't know how necessary and important it is to actually grieve through our losses, we just turn away from them and get on with things, right? And then gradually, over time, we Robert Bly called it the long bag we drag behind us, right? We just stuff our losses into this bag. And over time, this bag gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and until ultimately the load becomes so great that my experience is that we'll either do something or the universe will conspire to have something happen. We'll do something unconsciously, or something will happen to us that makes them suddenly all the ungrieved losses begin to show up all at once. You know, you might get a divorce, you might lose a job, whatever it is, you'll be, despondent or dealing with that particular issue, and then suddenly all these other memories of all these other losses will begin to infiltrate and permeate your awareness. A couple of years ago, I had an experience that was pretty traumatic and pulled up a number of losses. I spent like a week in bed, and the loss carried me all the way back to when I was 4 years old, and my father decided he was going to abandon the family. And I could just trace, a whole succession of losses related to that one. And now here it was again, presenting itself for even more integration and resolution. So we can delay grief, but we can't delay it forever and be optimally healthy, in my estimation.
Mark, just a question. Since you've done so much grief work, do you find that there is a link between delayed grief or unprocessed grief and addictions?
I think there's a link between ungrieved losses and the impulse toward medicating oneself, which is often what addiction is involved with addiction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But, I put on here, and I think, I've never been to a rehab program, so I don't know what goes on in any of them. But my suspicion is that some kind of grief work is usually involved with different rehab programs.
It seems to me, that's part of it, at least in my own practice, watching people who have delayed times many, many, many years,
Right. And turn to other avenues to try to manage their painful feelings.
Right.
Yeah. So I wrote on here, grief will out. And basically that was a saying that we used to have in the agency where I worked, and that simply meant that you can delay your grieving your losses, but you can't delay them forever, because healing wants to happen. The brain wants to be strong and healthy, and it wants to process energy information to its absolute utmost maximum. And so if grief is getting in the way of that, the brain notices and will do things will do whatever it can, when it can, to bring it to our attention. I've written a number of blog articles about how unconscious process basically forced me into kicking and screaming into consciously addressing ungrieved losses in my life. Yeah, there's a strong aversion to turning toward painful things. It's in part it's the way the brain's organized, right?
Yeah, but it's different in different people, I think.
I think you're right.
So that's always a puzzle. Some people actually, I like Melodoma Somé on griefs and funerals. I really enjoyed reading his description of the African rituals around grief. I mean, they would never consider not wailing and grieving after a death, or coming together as a community, or leaving a family isolated and alone after a death of someone they loved, But he said something interesting, which was, women, they can cry all the time. They cry easily. They don't have a problem with tears. But men need other men, and they need funerals to grieve and cry.
Yeah.
And I have really found that to be true to some extent in my practice. Granted, I'm a female therapist, but men will really be careful about crying in front of me.
Yeah. It's a very vulnerable feeling.
Yeah.
And all your defenses basically have to be softened or removed in order to be able to. And the culture's doesn't really champion that for men.
Right.
Isn't it an evolutionary survival mechanism?
It's partly tied into that, I suspect. You don't want to be out at a war party in tears while you're going into battle. Right? Or on the football field. There's no crying in football or baseball.
Wouldn't it be great, though, if there was an alternate league?
It would be great. From a healing perspective, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and so I wrote here grief will out, and I made a reference to Freud and Pierre Genet's repetition compulsion. And I'm pretty convinced when I read about stories of repetition compulsion that it's essentially our brain and body trying to orchestrate healing. Unconsciously putting ourselves into a situation that triggers traumatic memory so that we can do what we need to do to integrate it. Freud thought the whole repetition compulsion was an attempt at mastery, which in some respects I suspect it is. But mostly that doesn't happen. If you get in a car accident, insurance companies will almost automatically raise your rates. Well, why would they do that? Well, because statistically they know that if you're in one accident, the probability that you'll be in another is significantly increased. And so actuarially speaking, and to make a profit, they need to raise your rates. Well, why would that be the case? I would think that the opposite would be true, right? If you're in an accident, well, you know what got you into the accident, and now you're going to try to avoid it. But that's not how the brain works.
Yeah.
Slide 7. What's the role of the body in processing grief and loss? So this is my own theory. And my theory is that we talked in previous slides about how excitatory and inhibitory neurons operate in the brain, and how there's roughly 70% of the brain's neurons are excitatory and 30% are inhibitory. And my theory is that what happens with grief is that our inhibitory neurons are called into action, And why we end up feeling depressed over loss of someone significant to us is because the brain is basically using inhibitory neurons to inhibit energy transmission and energy and information transmission. And it's doing it in order for us to be able to function. Right? I put a picture of some cells here, and the two chemicals primarily responsible for excitatory action potential firing, which is glutamate, and then GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, which serves the inhibitory function. And then if you click again, you'll see a picture, an electron photograph of actual neurons in the brain. This is from the Blue Brain Project. The pink ones are pyramidal neurons from the cortex going down into the lower structure, lower levels of the cortex. So there's 6 levels. And you can see wrapped around them are white inhibitory cells. And these actually keep these cells from firing. So this is the process by which I think the brain operates to help us deal with loss, so that we're not constantly, at the effect of grieving the loved one that we've lost. We can actually do things to operate during the day, right? At some point, because the number of inhibitory neurons in the brain is finite and limited, these inhibitory neurons have to give up this function. And the way they give up this inhibitory function so they can be used elsewhere later as we live our lives is by working through loss. So here's where it's really interesting to me. So a finite capacity of inhibitory neurons, if we have had a childhood that's filled with grief and trauma and loss and adverse childhood experiences, then presumably many of our inhibitory neurons are being taken up to deal with all those experiences. And so if we come into adulthood or we come into later periods of our lives when we haven't done the work of grieving these losses, we basically have significantly reduced resources available to actually deal with these things. Does that make sense?
I don't know.
Yeah?
I'm still mulling it. How about you?
Okay. What do you think, Chanel?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I've seen adults who have had highly traumatic childhoods, and they don't know how to even emotionally connect to what's now facing them.
Yeah.
Like the loss of a parent or the loss of a child. They're disconnected.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm not understanding in what you were saying. It almost sounded like you were saying you kind of use up your inhibitory neurons, so there's none left or something like that. Is that what you were saying?
Well, I'm not saying that there's none left. What I'm saying is you have a much significantly reduced capacity to turn toward life.
Yeah,
because you can't self-regulate.
Definitely. Yeah, that's right. So
inhibitor neurons help us self-regulate. In other words, so this is actually a slide from somebody who has epilepsy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if these inhibitor neurons weren't there, they would constantly be firing chaotic action potentials that result in a seizure and then going unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the way that this seems to work is that, there's a lot of things in the world and in my life that I would love to move toward, embrace, experiment with, engage in. And there's another part of me that feels really anxious and fearful about doing that.
Yeah.
And I think The reason, or one reason, is because of my reduced capacity to be able to self-regulate in the face of whatever these experiences might provide. Public speaking is a perfect example for many people, right?
Yeah.
It just overloads their whole neurophysiology with stress hormones to make it immensely uncomfortable. Well, if you've grieved, if you worked through, and this is my experience with kids and myself, if you've worked through a lot of your trauma and losses, a lot of your adverse childhood experiences and loss, you have many, many more resources available.
I think you know that it's not infinite, and you have some capacity for containment that you know about, something like that. I mean, I guess not thinking about neurons, just thinking about working with people. I know that when people are first starting to open
With
up
support.
With support, yeah,
right.
but they're first tentatively considering feeling something. They feel it coming up in their body, a sensation. They feel the tears starting to rise. They feel the places where they block it in their diaphragm, in their throat, and I might be working with them, just kind of encouraging them to allow, to allow the bodily response.
Neuroscience part of it.
What's that?
This is the social neuroscience part of it.
Yeah, right. And I know that, and I know from my own memory too, but I know that very often it'll be, now if I feel that feeling, and not necessarily grief, it could be rage, it could be anything. If I feel that feeling, there's an image that it will never stop.
Yeah.
Or the grief will be so great I will never stop crying, or I will beat down these walls. It will be so much rage. But actually, and I always explain it to people, actually it feels that way, and it never is. It might last 2 minutes. I mean,
It'll last a lot shorter if you work through it.
Yeah, but in reality, of course, but our inner experience of what it will be like to open up to withheld emotions is usually it's almost got an infantile grandiosity to it,
Mm-hmm.
And I remember feeling that myself. There's an ocean of tears here.
Right.
I would never stop crying.
And that's the fear, right? Grief feels so like fear.
Yeah, I mean, it feels.
C.S. Lewis.
I'm just barely hanging on to being normal or functioning.
Right. Yeah. All right, slide 8. How might the body help us process grief and loss? A research team based at Princeton University found that the physical activity reorganizes the brain so that its response to stress is reduced and anxiety is less likely to interfere with normal brain function. Running produced a large increase in the number of new neurons in the hippocampus, most important for remembering, from returning short-term memories into long-term memories, a brain region also shown to regulate anxiety. The brown cells are new neurons, which are more numerous in the ventral hippocampus, and the blue cells are mature neurons. Exercise reorganizes the brain to be more resilient to stress. So this is probably, if there's one takeaway from this thing, from this session on grief and loss, this is the piece I want to stress. Grief work is a physical process.
Well, I don't know.
Well, try it.
I'm not doubting.
If you try it, you'll see there's a qualitative difference. And I'm going to explain to you how I came to that realization in slide 9. So you know this guy, right?
He looks familiar.
So he's Daniel Walpert. He's the guy who calls himself a movement chauvinist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's a Cambridge neuroscientist. And basically his argument, and he makes it pretty compellingly, is that the primary function of the brain is to move the body. And if you watch that Mike Evans RSA talk where he describes the one thing, if he could prescribe anything to his patients, he's an MD, the one thing he would prescribe is getting out and moving the body a half hour a day.
Yeah.
Right? Body movement, the brain is built to move the body. If you don't move the body, the downside is huge. Right?
Yeah, I mean, as a body psychotherapist, I can, it's so clear that when I can get people to move, there is so much more accessible and so much more can move and so on. I guess where I'm getting stuck in this conversation is just about thinking about our culture in which people are running and running and exercising and actually not feeling very much. And sometimes I think that all of the exertion has to do with actually armoring against feeling.
Right. Right.
And it's so that's the other edge of it that I was just kind of sitting with. It's like, on its own, I usually encourage both the movement and the feeling to occur together, which people can rarely do in the gym or whatever they're doing.
Right, because it's not set up for that.
No.
But you're making the exact point, and the point is that the only way that movement works to help heal grief and loss is when the actual neurons involved with grief and loss are operating. Right. People are actually feeling things, and action potentials are really firing. Yeah, so in the gym is a perfect place to go avoid feelings and get exercise and think you're doing something important, which you are.
Right.
But you're not doing grief work.
Exactly.
Right.
And then sometimes I think you're even armoring against it somehow. And that's just intuitive, but it's kind of like, well, like runners. Runners are known to have a lot of rage. They run with their rage.
Well, I think it's borne out, too, by, I just had a friend last year who was like a runner in perfect shape. And one day she walked into her barn and just blew her brains out.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, slide 10. Another explanation for why working up a sweat enhances our mental capacity is that the hippocampus, our old friend the hippocampus, critical for learning memory, is highly active during exercise. When the neurons in this structure rev up, research shows that cognitive function improves. Studies in mice have revealed that running enhances spatial learning. Other recent work indicates aerobic exercise can actually reverse hippocampal shrinkage, which occurs naturally with age, boost memory in older adults. Another study found that students who exercise perform better on tests than less athletic peers. And moving the body as part of an intentional grieving process profoundly enhances the process. And how do I know that? If you go to this slide here, you'll see kids on a room filled with mats and balls in their jumpsuit banging into each other. You see that slide there? This is a perfect way to do grief work.
Oh my God, this looks... Tell me about the slide because I'm curious.
Okay, so essentially, some friends and I started this grief program for children, and it became pretty evident after the first year that the kids were doing way better than their parents, who were also part of the program. And what the parents did is they got together, they brought the kids in once a week for an hour and a half and left them with us, and then they went off as a group to sit with facilitators, grief counselors, and work together in a group, and the kids were with us and they worked together in a group. Well, we didn't really do much with the kids except for we did two things based on research that was available at the time. The first is the kids knew they were there for grief work, right? So we sit in circle at the beginning of each session. The kids have to only do two things. Say their name. Well, we knew their name. They had to say the name of the person who died and what they died from in circle. And that was it. And after that, then they were free to do anything that they wanted to in the context that of the activities we provided for them. And most of the activities that we provided for them are all right brain activities, like sand tray or clay or painting or tile making or just mask making, all things that mostly had to do with art, right? But here's the other piece that we did. We took a room about the size of the room we're looking at in slide 10 here, and we padded all the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. And then we hung a heavy bag from the ceiling, punching bag, and we put gloves in there, and we filled the room with pillows. And every week, the activity that the kids would self-choose, that they all wanted to do first, and they could only do it 3 at a time, was to go into the steam room and work out whatever it is they wanted to work out with each other. So the combination of the intention to do grief work, the fact that they were in a safe environment with other kids who shared the experience of loss, and then having this opportunity to physically interact in all kinds of, unrestricted ways, my feeling is made the kids work through their grief much faster than the adults.
Yeah. And that's been my experience with adult grief, too, working in different settings wherein there's kind of unrestricted, well, let's just say you make constructs within which you can safely explore all kinds of things that would be normally considered socially unacceptable to do.
Yeah. So physical movement as an integral piece of working with grief and loss, for me, is really high on the list. The next thing high on the list is slide 11, and that is the experience of feeling felt. So when we looked at that cartoon of the difference between sympathy and empathy, that's the difference between feeling felt and not feeling felt. Right? There's a kind of emotional resonance when we feel felt. And it's unmistakable. I mean, when someone is really getting what it is you're trying to express in terms of feeling and loss and the depth of fear or anxiety or stress that you may be experiencing. It's almost like they are tuned to your wavelength in a way that's unmistakable. Right? And so this is a pretty rare experience in the culture around these rituals that we have to deal with grief and loss, right? People telling you to get over it and giving you all kinds of unsolicited advice do not have you end up with the experience of feeling felt. And all that does is just prolong grief. And actually probably is detrimental. Yeah.
You can feel me holding back. Yeah, one of the things that I really notice about people that are grieving, Mark, and I wonder if you concur here, but I really notice the burden that's on grieving people to withhold their feelings from other people.
Protect other people.
To protect other people as if they're holding, we're all children. I mean, in a way we are, I did a blog once about grief is contagious, try to catch some, and it was about, just the infectiousness of the feelings that we feel and the responsibility people seem to feel from keeping everybody else from feeling their feelings. It just seems like an enormous burden.
Additional burden.
That they just shouldn't have to be feeling, right? Shouldn't it just be the other way around,
Yeah, exactly.
What you're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, even when people are in a structure that's specifically designed to help facilitate grief, I can't tell you the number of times people would try to protect me from the depths of their feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you keep coming back and keep coming back, eventually, grief will out, and it becomes safe and hopefully healing to do that. Slide 12, contingent communication, my favorite topic. So I just want to review this. This is the piece that builds connections in the brain and builds connections in the body and teaches us who we are in the world. This is the primary way we experience love and a reflection that helps us identify who we are in the world. To have emotional and mental states accurately assessed and clearly reflected, and then responded to in ways that are timely and effective. Telling people to get over grief is not contingent communication. And when we lose people who, in fact, we have had relationships with that were good in terms of effective communication, then this is a piece that's going on in our lives that is profound. Who are we now? That we no longer have the person in our lives that we had a relationship with. We're profoundly different. And we don't know who we are or who we're going to become in the wake of that loss until we've actually found some way to work through it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right, slide 13. How do anticipatory grief and grief involving unexpected loss differ? So I think we've touched on that a bit. With anticipatory grief, you're going to be suffering a loss. So the parts of your brain and body that are involved that can anticipate and begin to gently work through both disconnection, which is tricky in lots of ways, but how do I want to characterize this? Well, first of all, let me just say they are different, and they do change the brain differently. One is like having an abrupt amputation, a psychic energetic amputation, and the other is just having a gradual extended removal from your life. And you have a much greater time to adjust and to cycle back over and over, cycle back through the anticipated experience of loss. Yeah. So that's important to know, right? That all loss is not the same. All grief work is the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's this issue of trauma that I think, when I teach about death and dying, I usually start by making a distinction between death and trauma, because for many people they're merged as an idea. But death is a process and trauma is trauma, Healing through closure with somebody or ending with somebody is a process, but grief seems to point to, or I don't know, I guess this is your definition, but grief seems to point to the addition of trauma. And trauma has to do with our capacity and how suddenly we have to respond, really, right?
Often, yeah.
Well, that's how I see it.
So in psychiatry, there's this term called cathexis, which is basically conscious or unconscious investment of psychic energy in a person, idea, or any other object. And so decathexis is the process that is often involved with grief, and that is pulling our energy back, withdrawing it, and reclaiming it, and finding a way to integrate the 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 experience of no longer having the person, place, or thing in our lives. You know, last week, this is a kind of an interesting example. I lost my favorite jacket, and you wouldn't think that that losing a jacket would be so emotionally disturbing, but it really was to me. And so I spent a lot of time both thinking about and exploring what could have possibly happened to my favorite jacket. And I spent a full day looking all over the house for it. I went to bed that night, and I have a dream journal by the bed. I wrote down the dream journal. I incubated a dream and asked the question in the dream, what happened to my favorite jacket? And I woke up in the morning, and the first thing that I experienced was this body sensation around my shoulders and around my back. And it was the same body sensation that I experienced when a friend and I left a deli 4 days before. And I walked out of the deli, and I had that same feeling sensation. And immediately I made the connection. Oh, I'd left the jacket in the deli on the back of the chair. And when I walked out, I remember feeling uncomfortable, like I'd forgotten something. And then got distracted by the person I was with who couldn't find their car and didn't have a chance to actually sit with that and process it. And lo and behold, my jacket showed up. And that's where I left it. And when I got the jacket back, I could just feel this wave of reconnection wash over me. So it's kind of a everyday example, right? We're experiencing losses all the time, but mostly we just pass over them, right? Yeah, let's look at 14. How do I just... Go ahead, Chanel.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
How do you distinguish between somebody experiencing cathectic? How did you pronounce that?
Cathexis.
Okay, how do you, between that and fantasy?
That and what?
Fantasy?
I'm not hearing you. Could you spell it?
Fantasy, like...
fantasy.
You know,
with an
yeah.
S, yeah. Well, that's a good question. There's some people, and I guess I'm one of them, that think that much of our waking life is a fantasy. There's an old Talmud saying that says, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And if we just sort of hold that possibility, we begin to see that the things that we apprehend and respond to in the world are often things that are we make up and create emotional connections to, right? So like I was just describing an incident with my favorite jacket, right? It's my favorite jacket. Well, I have about 10 jackets, right? And they all perform the same function to keep me warm, but I just like this one for whatever reason, and this is the one I'm most attached to. But you could say that, my attachment and the fact that it's my favorite is a fantasy, right? Because I actually have some that are warmer and more expensive. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I guess what I'm just trying to distinguish here is if, in psychiatry, this is conscious or unconscious investment in psychic energy.
Right.
If someone is attached to a fantasy, they would invest a considerable amount of psychic energy into, a person, idea, or an object.
They do it. We do it all the time, don't we?
Right. So then are all, I guess, all fantasies would fall into this category.
Well, all things that we invest psychic energy into is the definition of cathexis. Whether or not, when I think of fantasy, I think of something that's not real, right? We invest energy into a relationship that's not reciprocal, then that's investing it into a fantasy, right?
But if someone has lost someone and they're no longer physically here,
I see what you're asking, right? So they're investing in the person and wanting them to not have died or gone,
and continue a relationship with that
right
entity now.
Right. Well,
that's an interesting question.
That's a very interesting question. I mean,
The reason I bring this up is because there's a lady who attends one of my yoga classes, and she lost her sister 8 years ago.
Right.
And she has not, her attachment to her grief and loss of her sister and her relationship with her sister's spirit has really caused quite a bit of emotional trauma for her family. But when she's in class, you can see that her mind is always, like, she'll talk during Shavasana, she's talking, and she's talking to her sister. And, I'm not going to say that her sister's spirit isn't there with her, but she has a full relationship with somebody who's no longer physically present.
Right. So here's the question. See, I think there's two possibilities here. One is she actually is the sister's energy actually is available and present, and she's in communication with it. That's one possibility. Right?
Right.
Another possibility is that she's completely dissociating because she hasn't worked through the loss. Is that another possibility?
Correct. So then would it fall into this category here? I can't even pronounce this word, so I'm not going to try.
Cathexis.
Yeah.
Well, cathexis is just...
It's not rolling off my tongue.
Right. It's a hard word. Well, cathexis is just the investment of energy, right? Now, you can invest energy in a fantasy, but if it's a dissociative process for you, then it's not healthy. Would you say that this woman is grounded in most other aspects of her life?
No, it's not healthy at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, and I know we have some time constraints here, but I just want to comment. I do think there's been work done on people, continuing bonds and so on, about that actually being healing for people to not have to think that they've lost everything about this person, that they can continue a relationship. I mean, personally, I think that seems to be evidence that might be true, that we're having some kind of real contact on some levels. Who knows? But there are these other levels where you're not really experiencing anything real, but a projection, right?
Yeah. So here's how I characterize it. This is why thinking about the brain in terms of its capacity to process energy and information is really useful for me. See, I think that there may be a level of energy and information processing that some people have attained and are capable of that actually can apprehend, extra or disembodied communication. But I don't think that's most of us. And I think that my bias would be to come down on the side of dissociated grief avoidance, unworked, non-resolution. That would be my bias. And if it's if it's problematic in a person's life, then it needs to be somehow addressed.
Right.
And it sounds like it's not only problematic in her life, it's problematic in the whole family's life.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a great question, yeah. I mean, how do we help people who are basically struggling with moving into and moving through the grief process? Which takes us to the next slide, 14. How do I discern if the help I'm getting is a good match for me? And I put this kind of a joke picture in here of some raccoons with the sign that says, "Hi, we're here to help you with the garbage." And what do I want to say about this question? So basically, my experience is, in working in this field for quite a while, is that it's really, really hard to get good help for lots of reasons. But the primary way that I would offer to have you assess whether or not you're getting good help is if you have the experience, mostly, of feeling felt. If you have the experience that someone really does get what you're going through, that you feel empathy rather than sympathy, that you feel an energetic connection with the person who's trying to be of help to you. One of the things I talked about with this group on Saturday was the notion of idiot compassion, right? So for a therapist, maybe working with this woman who's communicating with her sister after she's died, idiot compassion would be to not work with her in skillful ways that can help bring about the healing integration of grief over this loss. Right? So anytime we're enabling people to do things that cause them and other people pain and suffering, that's probably not compassion. Right? And we're probably not helping with the garbage. So this is really hard to do skillfully. I mean, I have experienced many, many more people who weren't very good at working with it and doing it than I have people who actually were good. All right. Questions at this point before we go on? You guys have been asking some great questions. All right. 16, whirlpool of grief. So we know how that grief is a process, and we know what the pieces are, and we know what it feels like, and we know what it means to go into it. We know what it means to avoid it. We know what shock, numbness, and denial look like. And we know that there's a way out of it and through it, and we know that it's possible to get there. Bereavement's what happens to you. Grief is what you feel. Mourning is what you do. Okay, does that help make it simple and clear? Yeah, reorganization and loving again. So a lot of what spiritual bypass involves is wanting to move to the stage of reorganization, loving again, before we've actually done the work of fully integrating the loss. So ricochet romances are a perfect example of why the things don't work out when we don't do the work, right?
So it almost has... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, integrating the loss, what does it mean? You know, but in my experience, it has to do with feeling.
Well, that's the process, feeling what you feel. When you move through the process, I have a slide coming up that actually lets you know when the process is complete. All right. The Year to Live. So basically, Stephen Levine wrote a book a number of years ago called A Year to Live, and he was inviting people to spend a year in a group with other people to pretend, this is actually a fantasy for most people, that you only have a year to live. And the advantage of pretending and engaging in this process is that you have your faculties, and you have your strength, and you have your brain operating in ways that it often doesn't when the end of life is upon us, right? The end of life can be very disorganizing for many, many people. It's hard to, unless you've actually spent time around dying people, it's really hard to know how the process impacts brain, mind, heart, body, and soul, because it does profoundly. So after he published the book, a friend and I got together and we organized a group of people who wanted to spend a year together and explore this process. And we had them sit down and write a list of things that they're most interested in exploring for the year. And here's the breakdown that they came up with, all the things they wanted to have put into their year and begin practicing. But there's one thing that I wanted to bring to our attention for this session, and that is the last thing on the list. This is the thing that people wanted to do least. Completing unfinished business. Right? This is the thing that people wanted to do least. From the standpoint of neurophysiology and social neuroscience, I would put this at the very top of the list. This is the thing we need to do most. Because what this will do is move us in the direction of addressing all the traumas that we've suffered in our lives at the hands of other people and organizations and cultural conditioning. By putting this up at the top, all the rest of the stuff will take care of itself.
Yeah.
But when we walk around with Robert Bly's long bag that we're dragging behind us and has all this unfinished business in it, that's a big load to carry through life. And once you are actually able to work through and begin to empty that bag, life looks very different. Slide 17. How might regret and guilt best be skillfully worked through? So I put basic 4 steps. First must come the recognition that it's even important to be mindful of. Most people don't know that this is important to address. That regret and guilt drive unconscious process and determine many of the things we end up attending to in our lives. What we turn toward and what we turn away from. Healing is continually trying to happen. From social neuroscience perspective, it's good to get help with the working through process from one or more people who can bear witness, who can feel us without being emotionally triggered themselves. So I made a note here of the Jack London process that took 5 skilled therapists to hold me and all the traumatic memories that surfaced. But briefly, what my Jack London process was, I took a workshop with Natalie Goldberg, and she invited us to write, and she invited us to write about what disturbs us. So what that directive is actually doing is inviting us to pay attention to feelings and images that emerge from the right brain, primarily, where we store trauma. And once you give yourself permission to actually have that stuff surface, guess what? It will, in spades. And so I took this, actually it was a 2-year process to explore this and write about things that were disturbing me for 2 years. And I needed to have 5 therapist friends, help me through the whole process. One of them couldn't hold it. I couldn't hold it. I certainly couldn't hold it by myself. All right. And then when I was done, I ended up having a novel that I submitted to the Jack London organization, and it won their prize that year, which was a surprise to me. So that's important, right, from a social neuroscience perspective. We need other people's help to do grief work. And then number 3, it most likely needs somatic components attached to it. The body's energetically connected to people, places, and things in our lives through our distributed nervous systems. We often end up feeling helpless in the face of traumatic loss, a unique kind of freeze response. It's important to realize that grief work is rarely one and done, which I wish it was, but it's not. It operates much like human development in a recursive spiral as the integration process works to consolidate healing. Before this call started, Chanel and Jean and I were just talking about how if we're awake and actively working in our lives with the grief and growth process, it's a lifelong process. We're always, just like neurons in the brain are always making connections and making disconnections, the same process is going on in our lives. We lose people, we lose jobs, we grow out of things that we once were passionate about. The brain is wonderful at accommodating, getting used to stuff, acclimating. It no longer provides the compelling energy that it once did. Yeah. What is the purpose of grief's recursive spiraling nature? Slide 18. I found this image, and this image really spoke to me in terms of what grief and growth feel like. It's almost like they're a double helix themselves, right? You can't have one without the other. And so when I think about it, and when I look at my own experience, and I look at the research that I've done on it, basically what it looks like is that there's this pulsation or this alternating pattern of growth and grief, growth and grief, growth and grief.
Yeah.
And it's all moving us in the direction of an increasing capacity to process energy and information. And you can find out more about this sort of recursive spiral development in this book by a colleague of mine called Pathway of the Soul. Hilary Rumet is a teacher she was a teacher at Sophia University, where I was also teaching. And she wrote this wonderful account of just how this recursive spiral of development, that it must include grief, actually operates. All right. 19. How do psychological defenses operate during grief and loss? So here they are. The heart, this is my friend Rodney, he's a Buddhist social worker who used to run Hospice of Seattle. He's one of my few heroes in the world. Rodney says, the heart contains all the energy necessary to investigate our pain, end our personal narrative, and free the contracted mind, but only when our attention is not fractured by our defense mechanisms. So here's a chart that shows a few of them. And we actually need defense mechanisms to operate in the world, right? And one of the first rules of grief counseling was you never take away a person's defense mechanisms. You let them do what they need to do until the person's no longer ready to deploy them. Right? You can't force grief. So here are 11 of them on slide 20. And there are quite a number more, but here's 20 that I just wanted to bring to your awareness. Some you might not be, many of them you're probably aware of, but one you might not be is reaction formation. And we see this a lot in people in grief, adopting or expressing the opposite of one's true feelings or motives. You know, put on a happy face. Pretend like everything's all right. Pretend like you're handling it, right?
Okay. And one thing I noticed, Mark, and again, I'd like to just pick your brain here about what your experience was, but in the development or the evolution of grief, one of the things I guess I noticed is that people that are still really actively grieving or fighting against the grief or trying to manage their grief by making certain kinds of stories will often have very black and white views of either the person that died or their feelings or their stories about them.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a lot at funerals, right? She always did this. She never was angry, you know. So I don't know. How would you say that's working here?
Well,
You know what I mean?
yeah, dichotomies are part, in my experience, they're part of a developmental, developmental trajectory. You know, it takes a certain level of integration of the brain, actually, to be able to think in complexities that are different than dichotomies.
Right.
Right? You know, in certain venues where I did a lot of learning and teaching, the impulse or the directive was not to think either or, but think both and. Right? Well, that's a great directive, but it's not so actually to do easily if you haven't developed the internal resources to be able to authentically do that. Right? Teenagers are great for black and white thinking. Right. And the primary reason is because they don't have sufficient neurological network capacity to think in terms of great complexities like that. And bankers on Wall Street don't have capacity to think in terms of complexity like that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's getting late out here, so my brain isn't working so well, you know.
All right, so let's just go through those last few slides here. So 11 psychological defense mechanisms that are connected to the Enneagram. So I'm guessing a number of people on this call are familiar with the Enneagram. There's Oscar Kaizo, and I think he was in Argentina, came up with this diagram on personality identification, came up with 9 different kinds of personalities. And he determined that each of these different fixation points on the Enneagram has their own particularly predictable or familiar or most comfortable way of being defended in the world. And so this doesn't describe what the different kinds of personalities are. So for me, on the Enneagram, I used to be a 6. I'd probably have moved more toward 7 as I've integrated and gotten a little more healthier. And so projection and rationalization are things that I actually do have to deal with a lot. Other people might have to deal with some of these other ones. So if you don't know the Enneagram, and you don't know your number on the Enneagram, it might be interesting to explore. Jean, do you know your number?
I actually don't.
Oh. How about you, Chanel?
I don't.
Okay. Yeah, it's just an interesting, it's sort of like Myers-Briggs is one personality classification system, Enneagram's another.
So are they hierarchical?
No,
I think I might have been a 4, but I can't remember.
Yeah. Okay. All right. What is disenfranchised grief, and how can I best address it? This is a big problem in the culture.
Yeah.
Grief that's not acknowledged by society. And I'm just going to give you a few examples. The loss of a pet, a trauma in the family, a generation prior. So this, like, I put a slide up here for people from the Holocaust. You know, their grief and loss affects their children, unborn children.
Absolutely.
Right? The loss of a home or place of residence, especially for children who have little or no control in such situations. An aborted or miscarried pregnancy, a mother's loss or surrender of a child to adoption. Right? So these are all losses that aren't readily acknowledged in the culture and that people don't understand or know or feel they need to actually grieve. There's another section on them, the death due to socially unacceptable causes such as suicide or drugs. Right? Death of
Fertility.
Death of a celebrity. How many people displace their grief onto Princess Diana's death? Right? Losing bodily function. You know, as we all go through the aging process, our body is continually declining in its capacity to function. And yet how many of us actually take the time and have the recognition that this is something that needs to be grieved? Loss or breakup of a secret relationship. And who's going to have compassion and sympathy who's out there having an extramarital affair and it breaks up? It's, you know, it's just desserts, right? Botched cosmetic surgery practices. I put a picture in here of, I forget his name. You recognize him?
Mickey Rourke.
Mickey Rourke, yeah. I put a picture of Mickey Rourke in here. Look at that. Why would you go have cosmetic surgery? There's something about that just is an indicator to me that your brain is not working well. You know, make that trade. But again, you know, botched cosmetic surgery. Who thinks that, you know, anybody deserves compassion and sympathy for that? Diagnosis of sexually transmitted disease. And then probably my favorite one that I'm constantly or frequently having to address for myself is lost computer files. You know, like we have a lot of power outages here. And most of the stuff I generate on the computer gets saved, but sometimes it doesn't. And when we have one, I can just feel that feeling, you know, in the pit of your stomach, like, oh no, right? And then I actually have to get up and move my body, and you know, I have a portable punching pad here that I use and take out, and we'll often put that to work. It's one of those things that boxers use, you know, to train with. Somebody will hold it or put their hands on it, and then the boxer punches it. I don't know if you've ever seen those. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I have one in my office.
Yeah. Okay, and then finally, grief over life not fully lived. So this was in the blog either this week or last week, where I listed those 5 top regrets of people on their deathbed. And these came up in, you know, the Year to Live program that we did as well. You know, and part of what the Year to Live program was to help people come to the end of their life not having these regrets. Right?
That's the beautiful thing about death work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a little different than grief work, but
it's got the same intention, right? To actually move us in the direction of living as much life as we can manage. I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself and not a life others expected of me. This above all, Shakespeare knew, to thine own self be true. And then 2, I wish I didn't work so hard. I found a GIF with a guy on a spinning wheel. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. Many people suppress feelings in order to keep peace. Number 4, I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. And I put a calendar in here to sort of demonstrate what so many of our lives are like, right? No time for friends.
Mm.
I wish I had let myself be happier. Well, this one's tricky, right? Because my argument would be that we don't actually let ourselves be happier. That what we need to do, that happiness turns out to be a byproduct of actually doing the work of healing, of increasing our brain's capacity to process energy information. A byproduct is happiness because you have more energy, more awareness, more sensory awareness, more of life that we can be aware of and present to. 4 and 5, I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends, and I wish I'd let myself be happier. And then, silliness is the only thing in this world that has no form, but then it's not really a thing, and it's not of this world. And I put a picture in here of apparently this is an old joke, the one on the yoga balls there, or exercise balls there, but I never saw it, and it just made me laugh. That's the kind of silliness I think he's talking about. Yeah. So how do I know when a piece of grief work is finished? And I put 2 words. And the 2 words are coherent narrative. And remember, coherent narrative is the same thing that we use to know when someone has done the work of accomplished and earned adult secure attachment. I don't know if you remember that from the 3rd or 4th session. So coherent narrative simply means we can talk about the loss, we can talk about the adverse childhood experiences, we can talk about traumas that have happened to us coherently without becoming emotionally overwrought. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When we're still in the midst of grief work, or we're still doing the work of trauma, it's very hard to do because we become emotionally drawn back to the experience. It's actually alive in us in the present moment because it hasn't been fully integrated. But once it has, then we can just talk about it as if it's just something that happened, and it's unfortunate that happened, but it's over now, and we can be present to our life as it's unfolding in the here and now. We aren't constantly intruded upon by traumatic memories or wistful longings or regrets. All right, further exploration. So I put Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book with David Kessler on Grief and Grieving. And then Joan Didion's book, she's a really wonderful writer, and her book, A Year of Magical Thinking, won the National Book Award. It's an account of her sitting at the dining room table one night and her husband just stopping breathing. At the same time, her daughter was in the hospital having a near-death experience. And her account of what it's like to go through that process is just absolutely compelling.
Mm.
And then finally, here's Stephen's book, A Year to Live. How to live this year as if it were your last. I just mentioned this. So Stephen Levine is someone I have an enormous amount of respect for, and I've probably been a student of his even though he doesn't know me, for 25 years. And I subscribe to he's old now, he and his wife, and they live in New Mexico, and I subscribe to a monthly podcast, Couch Talks is what he calls them. And once a month, I get a couch talk from him. And they're just really wonderful to have him sort of be my teacher even now after all these years.
Mhm.
He's just delightful. He and his wife, they've worked with death and dying for, I don't know, 50 years. And what's also interesting about it is they are on an end-of-life trajectory. You know, they can't travel anymore. And Andrea, his wife, has leukemia. She's had it for 30 years. Been working with it actively. And he's got bad knees and hips and can't get about anymore. And so they're sort of exemplars for how to actually do this part of our lives. And then for next time, I'd like to invite you to watch this, if you haven't seen it already, the Brene Brown TED Talk, which we'll be exploring when we do the next session in 2 weeks. So there you have it.
All right.
It's been a
All
long
right.
one, but I appreciate you hanging in there.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, and then we'll meet again. And again, any time between now and the next session, if people want to be in touch, I'm happy to hear from people, respond any way they might like. All right? So that's it for now.
All right, Mark. Thank you.
Take
Nice
care,
to-
and thank you guys.
Good night, Chanel.
Good night, Mark.
Good night, Chanel.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Okay.